This is a production of Cornell University.
And wanted to start with, particularly agricultural historians are often will indicate that plows are one of the markers of a civilized agriculture, a more developed agriculture. This first is a quote from Hurt, who is an American agricultural historian, and you see here his quote, through the ages the plow has been the most important agricultural tool. Indeed, without it, farmers could not till the soil and prepare their fields for extensive agriculture. But even more closer to home, our own Liberty Hyde Bailey said that tillage is so universal and so obviously essential to successful agriculture that we accept it without questioning its origin. Yet, among modern farmers, tillage is rarely practiced with sufficient frequency to produce the best results. But prior to colonization, farmers in the Western Hemisphere had no access to plows nor to draft animals. And yet they had very both extensive and intensive agriculture that was accomplished completely by hand. And I show you three pictures here, one from Machu Picchu of Incan agriculture on terraces, another two from Mayan and also Aztec agriculture. Again, intensive agriculture, but without plows involved. The last picture in the corner, the black and white, is a drawing by a Jesuit who was visiting Mohawk country in the 17th century. And this is a picture of a Mohawk woman with a hand tool, also probably planting corn. So what I wanted to do this afternoon, we have a unique opportunity to look at the effects of tillage in one place over several hundred years, both agriculture with and without tillage, right here in kind of western New York. But I want to start out with the Mohawks, who were growing corn over closer to the Hudson Valley. And this is a quote in a journal by a Dutchman, Adrian Cornelissen van der Donk. And he was in the Hudson Valley in 1653. And he says, he wrote in his report, the women do all the farming and planting. They grow no wheat, oats, barley, rye, etc., and are unacquainted with plowing and spade work, and do not keep their lands tidy. They know nothing of manuring, fallow seasons, and proper tillage. The labor they devote is all manual, using small adzes. Nevertheless, they raise so much corn and beans that we purchase these from them in fully loaded yachts and sloops. So there is this indication of a productive agriculture taking place here in what is today New York State that was done completely without plows and other types of mechanized or major tillage operations. So I'd like to examine that in more detail. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Mohawks were one of the original 5 nations of the Iroquois Confederacy, and the map on the right shows you what those territories looked like about 1650. And the map on the left shows the Iroquoian language speakers, the kind of dark purple. The Iroquois Confederacy, as we know them, were part of a larger group of native peoples who spoke similar language called the Iroquoian languages. And this is what it might have looked like before Europeans first came. So you see people of similar language, the dark purple, inhabiting or residing in a fairly large portion of the Northeast, certainly all of New York. But let me go back once more here. So I talked about the Mohawks, and the Mohawks were where we saw the first quote about how their agriculture was productive, even though they knew nothing of plows or manures or fallows or anything else. But we're going to move west over into Cayuga and also Seneca territory. a map of Iroquois settlements that were in existence sometime between 1350 to 1730. And what I've done, just for your kind of orientation, is to place Ithaca, Geneva, and Rochester on them. Now the triangles that are dark are ones that were before 1550, and the ones that are light colored are those that were occupied after 1550. Agriculture in Iroquois communities intensified sometime about 1450 and onward, and what we see is there was a kind of concentration of many settlements along that kind of east-west axis. And let me show you a little bit more of this. If we look at where the Iroquois settlements were and where most of the agriculture was taking place, it's in this broad area outlined in red here that happens to contain some of New York's most agriculturally productive land. If we look at Iroquois maize and how it was managed, we know that it was controlled by women, that the crops were planted without plows, there are no draft animals, that the fields were continuously cropped, and that it was a highly productive agriculture. So you might say, well, what evidence do we have of that productivity? Well, they come from two areas. First, historical documents. The book on the right, General John Sullivan's Indian Expedition of 1779, contains lots of the diaries and journals of officers involved in the Sullivan Campaign, which came up into Cayuga and Seneca territories. We also have available some contemporary field experiments that I've done that have looked at what crop yields might have been. But let's look first at these historical documents, and they come from two primary areas, both of them as a result of European attacks, particularly on Seneca territories in both the 17th and 18th centuries. And both of these incidents, these two historical incidents about 100 years apart, provide us a lot of information on maize productivity. The first one is Denonville. This is the guy up there, 1687, a Frenchman. He goes into Ganondigan. That's the one in blue there. That's located, if you've been to the Ganondigan historical site in western New York, in Victor, New York, it's just south of Rochester. This was one of the major Iroquois, actually Seneca settlements at that time. And then Sullivan, 100 years later, went all around Cayuga Lake, Seneca Lake, but more specifically over into the western part of New York, through Canandaigua and one of the major areas called Genesee Castle. Well, let's first look at Denonville, and this is a map that was made after his time. It actually has Sullivan's campaign on it as well, but he came down from Lake Ontario through this area, what today is Rochester, and then he began marching quite a large army down into Seneca territories. And the reason for doing this was that the Seneca were collaborating and allied themselves with Great Britain. And France and Great Britain were at war over who was going to control North America. And Denonville knew that the Seneca had large fields of corn and that they were supplying British troops with corn. So he was coming down in order to try to destroy and to frighten, intimidate, and reduce the capacity of these Seneca villages from providing English soldiers with food. And so Ganondigan was the site of a major granary storage area and was kind of the heart of Seneca maize agriculture. Well, Denonville reported in letters back to his superiors in France that over 9 days he and his men destroyed over 1 million bushel of corn, and that it was both stored corn and corn that was green in the field. And you can see what he writes here about it. After having destroyed a vast quantity of fine, large large corn, beans, and other vegetables of which there remained not a single field, and after having burned so large a quantity of old corn, that would be stored corn, that the amount dare not be mentioned. The quantity of corn which we found in store in this place and destroyed by fire is incredible. All right, so we have one picture and a fairly detailed description of what agriculture looked like in major Seneca areas where they were growing corn. About 100 years later, John Sullivan comes into almost the exact same area, but he makes a much more extensive trip through central and western New York. And he was ordered by George Washington, who gave him these instructions in a letter in early 1779, in May of 1779. And he writes that the immediate objectives are the total destruction and devastation of their settlements, meaning primarily Seneca, Onondaga, and Cayuga. It will be essential to ruin their crops in the ground and prevent their planting more. And the reason for this, once again, was that the majority of the Iroquois, 4 out of 6 nations, had sided with Great Britain in the Revolutionary War. So once again, they were supplying British soldiers with corn. So Sullivan is ordered to go up into this area and destroy villages and the crops. And these little dotted lines show where he went. There actually a couple of them came. Clinton came from this direction. Sullivan came from farther south in Pennsylvania. They went up. This would be Cayuga Lake and Seneca Lake. First going up along the eastern side of Seneca, going all the way out west to what is today Genesee, coming back down along the western side of Cayuga Lake, and then up along the eastern side. And all of the time burning villages and, more importantly, destroying cornfields. Well, out of this campaign, we have the diaries and journals of a number of the officers who participated in this campaign. And I've just picked out, I think there's 6 here, 5, that all are from late August, and they were in primarily areas around Genesee, a little to the east of Genesee, Canandaigua, and a bit farther west. And these officers describe the corn that they saw, the agriculture that they saw, and you see the quotes: 150 acres of the best corn I ever saw. In such quantities would be almost incredible to a civilized people. Some corn stalks measuring 18 feet, and a cobs 1.5 foot long. We found 200 acres of exceedingly good corn, intermixed with beans and squashes, pompions, and a few potatoes. We destroyed large fields of their corn. They plant with as much exactness as any farmer. So a very detailed picture of productive and extensive agriculture. These are not backyard gardens. These are large agricultural fields, 100, 150 acres, 200 acres. Sometimes there were records or quotes from these officers that they saw cornfields that were more than a mile in length. So huge amount of agriculture going on, and obviously indicative of a fairly productive and high-yielding agriculture. So that's part of what the information from historical documents tells us. But we also have some from field experiments, and this is work that I started back in 1993 and carried through to 1997. We did it at 2 sites, one right in this area in Cayuga County at the Musgrave Research Farm, and the other outside of this very highly productive area in Tompkins County on a farm about 8 miles east and south of Ithaca. Today I'm just going to show you the results from Cayuga because I think they are most representative of what of what Iroquois farmers would have been able to achieve, since they're in the same area, same climate, same soils. So we used a maize variety, an open-pollinated white flower corn that is still grown by Iroquois people today. From everything that we know, it is very similar to what was grown here, probably in the 15, 16, 17, and 1800s. So it's quite similar. It's an open-pollinated variety, has a much lower yield potential than do our modern hybrids. And we used agronomic practices that were as similar as we could make them to what the Iroquois would have used in the 17th and 18th centuries. We tried for populations and for spacing. We did some variations, but we tried for things that we thought would be realistic. So these are from 2 years in Cayuga County, and we had 2 different populations, 10,000 and 20,000 plants per acre, and we planted them at 2 different spacings, one a 40-inch and a 60-inch. And what we found in both years was that the highest yields, not surprisingly, came from the narrow spacing and the high population. And so at the very highest yields, we were getting close to 75 bushels per acre, right? And the very lowest in 96 at 10,000 plants and a wide spacing about 38 bushels per acre. So we saw that as there's all sorts of indications that the Iroquois planted at fairly high populations. So my guess is that the 40 inches and 20,000 plants per acre is probably realistic. And so somewhere between 50 to 75 bushels per acre is probably a fairly typical yield. So the question immediately is, are these yields realistic? Talking about 50 to 75 bushels per acre of Iroquois corn, how does this match up with what we know? Well, we have plenty of records that under good management, open-pollinated maize in the United States in the 19th and early 20th centuries frequently yielded 75 to 100 bushels per acre. But the important words there are good management. And these were on fields that were even, in fact, we have records of 200 bushels per acre in the 19th century in New York State, and open-pollinated corn, right? But these are in fields that were either newly opened, meaning they had not been previously cultivated, or they had been rotated and or received applications of animal waste. But many people in the field of particularly anthropology would find fault with this, right? If you look in the literature of what yields are purported to be amongst Native Americans in both generally North America, but more specifically in Eastern and Central North America, their yields are much, much lower, what they estimate the yields to have been. And one of the major persons who's been doing this work is an anthropologist at Wisconsin, Schroeder. And she says in an article from 1999 that 10 to 15 bushels per acre was typical, and that other people that had been claiming either 25 to 30 bushels per acre, or even much above 15, that this was an exaggeration. Now, Heidenreich and Trigger are 2 anthropologists who have studied the Huron, who are closely related in Ontario. And their work indicated 15 to 25 bushels per acre of corn was what they thought would be typical. And then Baden was working in Tennessee at an earlier time with Mississippian period farmers. This would have probably been around 1300. And he surmised or estimated that the yields would have been in the range of 12 to 25 bushels per acre. So what is the rationale for these estimates? Well, all 4 of these scholars have based their estimates on yields that U.S. and Canadian farmers would get when they grow corn continuously on plowed fields, but without adding fertilizers or any other source of nitrogen. And these modern farmers, when they were questioned, indicated that their corn yields declined quite steadily after 5 years or less of continuous corn without fertilizers. Not surprising. If you grow corn for 5 years and plow every year on land that's not been manured or received other nitrogen sources, yields go down. So they surmised from that native farmers would have experienced the same yield reductions, forcing them to either open new lands in what people think of as typical of the entire Western Hemisphere, shifting cultivation, or to accept declining yields. And so I would challenge that interpretation, and I challenge it primarily because they have neglected the role of organic matter and tillage in soil fertility. In pre-industrial cropping systems, plant nutrients, and here I'm talking exclusively about nitrogen because I think this is the key, the controller of corn yields. There's 3 ways that farmers can get it: animal waste, legumes, or soil organic matter. Well, native farmers in the Americas didn't have animal waste, and they didn't have legumes. They didn't have forages to rely on either. They relied exclusively on soil organic matter. And tillage plays a key role in the ability of soil organic matter to provide nitrogen. So without considering the role of tillage in soil organic matter, the explanations and the rationales that these other scholars have presented don't really stand up. And here's why. We know, this is a graph from Brady and Wild, The Nature and Property of Soils. Probably, if you've taken the soils course, you've seen this. This shows the effects of tillage on soil organic matter. And we start out on the left-hand side, if that axis is the amount of soil organic matter in tons per hectare. And the horizontal axis is increasing time, going from 0 up to 130 years, right? And the soil organic matter is divided into these different components. First, plant residues in the very bright green, then the active organic matter, then slow organic matter, and then what they term the passive organic matter pool. Now, almost all of the nitrogen that is released upon decomposition of soil organic matter comes from everything but the passive organic matter pool. In other words, this is it does great things in terms of structure and other things for soils, but in terms of providing nitrogen, almost nothing. All of the nitrogen comes from these areas. Very fast from plant residues and very fast from the active organic matter, more slowly with the slow organic matter. What we see is that with time, these pools go down very, very quickly. And by 10 years, we've seen a very steep decline in the total amount of soil organic matter. And almost all of that loss has been from the portion that provides nitrogen to crops. Notice here we get out to a place where it plateaus. Usually this would be about 2% soil organic matter. And at this point, the soil's ability to release nitrogen for uptake by plants has almost bottomed out. So if we were looking at yields, they would go along the same place, staying pretty high up here, but then all of a sudden beginning to go down. And then they would parallel this line, right? So your yields will go down. You'll still get something, but your yields will drop quite strongly. Notice here, organic matter management improved, or the land is put back into native vegetation, and these active sources begin to rebuild. And if you cultivated again when you were over here, you would get an increase in crop yields. So we know that when we plow, we initially increase soil fertility. If you go into a land that has not previously been plowed, then you will get really nice yields if the soil organic matter levels are reasonably high. That's because we get the oxidation of of the soil organic matter. That oxidation releases nitrogen in forms that plants can take up. Since nitrogen is usually the most limiting nutrient for cereal grains, yields increase. And plowing fields that have been fallowed or pastured and allowed to accumulate soil organic matter is a reliable mechanism for providing nitrogen to crops, and it's used worldwide. The problem happens when we continue to plow and plow and plow, and we get on this downward curve, and we don't add some other source of nitrogen, or we don't rebuild the soil organic matter. Less nitrogen gets released every year, and grain yields inevitably decline. So these soils eventually reach what about a 2% soil organic matter, in which no further loss happens, but then very little nitrogen is released at that plateau. And farmers will typically call these soils worn out. Right? We know that the single largest cause of decreased soil organic matter in agricultural fields is plowing, tillage. All right, so let's begin to put all of these pieces together. As I mentioned before, the Iroquois were growing their maize in this area of central New York that we know is our most productive soils. One of the reasons that those soils are productive is that they're alfisols. This first map shows all of the alfisols in the United States. Don't pay any attention to the different colors. Those are just moisture regimes. But notice, alfisols right there in the center of New York State. No surprise that those are our most agriculturally productive soils. Our other large group, and even better soils, are mollisols. But those are located more towards the west and in the center part of the country. But notice also that the good soils in the eastern part of the country, there's not much of them. Right? These alfisols are here in parts of Pennsylvania, and a little smatterings of them down here, but there's not a lot of good agricultural land on the eastern seaboard. Iroquois were very fortunate to be residing in that area of really nice soils. So they're growing maize on these highly productive soils. So the question is, what would happen if you grew corn continuously on these alfisols, but without tillage? Would we expect to see a decline in crop yields? And I would say it depends on two things. First, what is the initial level of the soil organic matter? And second, how much corn are you taking off? What are your yield levels? Those are the things that would control. It's very hard to find information on unplowed alfisols. They don't exist, right? But from what I can gather, a 4% soil organic matter would be a conservative estimate of what an unplowed alfisol would contain. That would release somewhere between 80 to 160 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year. We know that from precipitation and decomposition of plant residues, you could probably get another 15 to 30. So this gives us a total available of somewhere between 100 and 200 pounds. If we look at how much nitrogen we're taking off, 75 bushels per acre of maize removes somewhere between 75 to 125 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Now, we know always that we have to have more nitrogen than what the plant actually takes up, right? So you know you have to have more, but it's clear that we have 1.5 to 2 times as much nitrogen in this system, and we could take off 75 bushels per acre of nitrogen every year, provided that the soil organic matter level stays at 4%, meaning that the land is not plowed, and that there is no need for additional nitrogen inputs. In other words, that farmers in Iroquois in 1687, when Denonville came down, could have had great high yields, and 100 years later, perhaps even in that same field, farmers could have still been getting 50, 75, perhaps even 100 bushels of corn. That is not unreasonable, and the thing that holds it together is the fact that they're not plowing. All right, but things change. Iroquois were dispossessed of their land, after the Revolutionary War. And this dispossession sets up an opportunity for us to look at, to have our own experiment of what happens when farmers come in and use plows. What happens to corn yields then, particularly if they're using the same types of open pollinated varieties, which they were, right? So this is what the map on the left is what things looked like in 1720. About 100 years later, the Iroquois have been reduced to these small territories, reservations, and U.S. farmers have flooded into the area, taking over these areas. If we looked at this map today, the areas of land that Iroquois people can control would be probably about 25% of this, even smaller. So we get this sweep into what had been Iroquois country and now becomes New York State. And in 1799, there was efforts by land speculators to try to determine what the agricultural potential of this area was called, and they referred to it as the Genesee country. And so we get these reports of people visiting this land who were looking to sell it to farmers, and they wanted to know what the agricultural potential of it was. All right, so this is there's a whole series of what are called letters from a gentleman to his friend in 1799, and this is a land speculator, and he's telling other speculators kind of what he thinks the agricultural potential of this. And he says the flats of the Genesee River and the Canascraga Creek alone cannot be estimated at less than 80 miles in length and about 2 in breadth, forming a body of about 8,000 acres. And every acre is, I suppose, 18 feet deep of black mold. Perhaps a bit of an exaggeration, but if you've been out in the Genesee Valley and looked at some of those soils, you know not much. It's pretty nice looking soils out there. He said, in such land, the Indians raise 100 bushels of corn on an acre, and they never have been known to make any change of the spot. In other words, they're continuously cropping, and they're getting 100 bushels of corn per acre. Now this guy's trying to sell land, right? So there's probably an exaggeration to it, but not a whole lot. More quotes. The famous Genesee Flats are about 20 miles in length and about 4 miles wide. The soil is remarkably rich, quite clear of trees, and producing grass near 10 feet high. In places we found openings of 200 and 300 acres, free from all timber and even bushes, which on our examining proved to be of a rich, deep soil. Corn generally grows to the amount of 30 to 40 bushels on an acre, and on flats of the Genesee River and of Mud Creek it is said to the extent of 70 to 80 bushels an acre, and is very heavy and substantial in quality. At this time, even 30 to 40 bushels per acre, what colonial farmers and early American farmers had been getting, the typical yields along the eastern seaboard on those worn out soils were lucky oftentimes to be 25 bushels to the acre of corn, and usually around 10 to 15 of wheat. So they were coming from a perspective of soil's not great, soils get worn out, we don't expect great yields. Here, 30 to 40 bushels on an average place, and on some of the better, 70 to 80 bushels per acre. So this last quote comes from McNail, who wrote The Agricultural History of the Genesee Valley, 1790 to 1860. This was written in 1952, and he kind of, he sums up, he provides a picture of what it looked like. The information which they heard of the Genesee country made it appear to land seekers a veritable agricultural paradise. The land was ready, and to the east, farmers, pressed by circumstance, prepared to move into new areas. These were predominantly New Englanders who had been trying to grow crops on Dispossessions and had not been having a great deal of luck after the first flush of soil organic matter had been removed. They were growing wheat, things were not looking good, they were hungry for new land. The Genesee country looked like the answer to farmers' dreams. So this is what happens. In 1810, The map there on your left shows dots. Each dot represents 100 in the Genesee country, right? And you see by 1860, the population has just absolutely, you know, I don't know what the total numbers is, but it's multiplied, you know, many, many times. The population just increases dramatically. So this is what the area looks like. It includes these counties, but I'm concentrating mostly on these upper ones because this is where the more fertile soils are. The Allegheny ones are down, you're getting into the southern tier, not as great soils, but the northern half of the Genesee country is where these fertile soils are. So, after the entry of the U.S. farmers with their plow-based agriculture, what happened to maize yields? Well, there's very little information from 1800 to 1845 because the early New York agricultural censuses don't provide crop yield data. They provide production, but you don't know on how many acres, so it's almost impossible to get any sense. But by 1845, average maize yields in the best agricultural lands of western New York were less than 30 bushels an acre. So let's look at what happens from 1845 to 1940. At Genesee, Livingston, Monroe, Ontario, and I included Seneca, although that was not in the original Genesee country, but it is one of our highest producing agricultural states, and certainly a place that the Iroquois were growing their crops as well. You see that in 1845, the yields are considerably below 30 bushels per acre, and they kind of stutter along, occasionally growing up a bit, but it's not until, what is that, 1920, that we really get up to even approaching 50 bushels per acre, right? We begin to see some of these counties. Now, granted, these are averages. These are entire county averages. They include good farmers, poor farmers, and in-between farmers. So there is no doubt that there were some farmers that were getting better yields. But the more important question is, what enabled this increase from 25 up to 50? What was going on that allowed that to happen? Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. First, we have to talk about why did the yields decline. And what everybody would say is soil depletion. And again, this is McNall. This is the guy writing the history of the agricultural history of the Genesee Valley. He says New Englanders, remember, those are the folks that were flooding in here predominantly, knew little of the methods or importance of rotating crops. A three-crop system, rain, grass, and fallow, did little to maintain soil fertility. Soil ameliorants were conspicuously neglected. Animal manures were not systematically and carefully used. Artificial fertilizers were not employed. It says farmers, whether tilling the rich soils of the Genesee or elsewhere, were guilty of defective cropping practices. The fertility of their lands was sapped by repeated croppings, by poor rotation schemes, or none, and by the neglect of fertilizers. So how did the yields increase? How did farmers get around this problem? Well, it's the introduction of forage legumes saves them. Same thing happened in Europe with European wheat farmers. It was not until they discovered clover that plow agriculture becomes a sustainable practice. In the U.S., it's predominantly clover and later alfalfa. This is combined with the more careful use of animal manure, and this ameliorates the effects of intensive plowing. Forage legumes have very different characteristics than do grain legumes. So it's not good enough to just add a bean. We have a picture of peas here, right? And over there is alfalfa, right? Look at the difference in those two crops. The peas are an annual, and the amount of organic matter, biomass, and nitrogen that they contribute to the following crop is minimal. First, because we eat the pea, and most of the nitrogen goes with it, right? And unless we're returning night soil to the land, that nitrogen is lost. Second, there's hardly any biomass. Third, that crop dies as soon as it's cut. So once you go through and harvest the peas and you cut that plant, its growing period is over. Now compare that with a crop like red clover or alfalfa. Number one, you're not removing the grain. It's staying there. At most, you may be feeding it to an animal and returning the waste back to the land. But more importantly, it's a perennial. And every time you cut it, it's like, it says, whoopee, I can grow again. And it's got a root system that allows it to grow up again. And you can produce enormous amounts of nitrogen-rich biomass that either get plowed back in, or that you feed to an animal and return the animal waste back. The other thing that happens with forage legumes is that you're not plowing annually, because they have to be, they're perennials. It takes longer to get them seeded. Farmers keep them in for 2 to 4 years, and so you're not plowing those fields annually. So there's an opportunity to greatly increase soil organic matter because these crops remain in place. They reduce the amount of plowing, and they ameliorate or they repair the damage that's been caused by plowing, and at the same time they supply nitrogen to succeeding grain crops and to animals that you feed that forage to. So red clover is like the magic bullet for farmers in western New York, and it was primarily red clover and Timothy. Some farmers were using these in the 18th century, but it was not common. By 1839, New York led the nation in the production of hay. And Bidwell, another agricultural historian, says that in the wheat-growing region of the western part of the state, and he's talking about New York, it had been found that the growing of clover and the grazing of cattle and sheep on the depleted wheatlands would greatly increase their yields. And of course, the reason that that's happening is because it's restoring soil organic matter. So it takes forage legumes, along with the tight integration of animals and crops, to make plow-based agricultural systems in western New York both productive and sustainable. So here are the conclusions that I would draw from this. First, that Iroquois maize was highly productive and sustainable because first, they were farming on these very fertile alfisols with high levels of soil organic matter. The absence of plows, far from being a disadvantage, was the reason that they were able to maintain their soil organic matter because they weren't oxidizing it with intensive cultivation. New York farmers, on the other hand, didn't have a chance of maintaining those yields. They likely got them early in the first 1800 to 1840. Likely yields, at least in the early 1800s, were quite reasonable when they moved on to those alfisols. But certainly by 1845, the indication was that the yields their maize yields were not good at all. And that was caused by the reduction of soil organic matter that was a result of continual tillage. The lack of appropriate management practices, including forages, manure, and rotations was also a part of this. And of course, solving that problem required the introduction of forage legumes. So I'll end there and happy to take any questions. Yes, Chris.
So how did the Iroquois or the native peoples maintain their soil organic matter? I mean, they must have done something to get the corn into the ground.
Yes.
And they must also have taken off that yield because that's what the generals told us. They got a lot of maize off there. So why is the soil organic matter not being oxidized?
Because the most loss of soil organic matter comes from tillage, not from crop removal. So as long as the soil organic matter stays at 4%, which there's no reason to think that it won't, right? If you're not plowing up a whole field, there's no reason to think that it won't stay at 4%. And in fact, you're adding crop residues back to that mound. Weeds, corn stalks are all going back in. There's no reason to think that soil organic matter levels are going to decline. The major loss of soil organic matter at these yield levels comes from plowing, tillage, not soil removal, right? So as long as soil organic matter levels stay at 4%, the soil can continue to release, right? So it's not the crop that's taking out all of that nitrogen, it's the plowing, right? If you look at how much nitrogen is in a 75 bushel acre yield of corn, it's somewhere between 75 and maybe 125 pounds per acre of nitrogen. You've got more than enough in the soil organic matter to do that. I understand that some of it is getting oxidized, but you're only doing a small amount and you're replacing lots of crop residues back in that mound. So my argument is that the soil organic matter could be stable, and that's what accounts for the sustainability of the yield.
So how come they didn't spend all their time weeding?
Because they didn't have the same weeds. Almost all of our nasty weeds came from Europe. So you look at the worst weeds, no, it's the truth. You look at the worst weeds in the European imports, and they weren't plowing. Why do you think we have so many weed problems? Because we plow, and we create ideal conditions for weeds to germinate, right? So without plowing, they weren't doing that. They were not spreading weeds through animal manure, which is the way most of the weeds got spread from Europe, right? Came either with other stuff, eaten by animals, spread hither and yon through animal waste, right? None of those things were happening, right? So they were pretty damn lucky.
So
Yes.
if you take 80 to 100 pounds per acre of nitrogen off of each crop, as you just indicated, what is the pool of nitrogen that's in that untilled soil in terms with the same, how many 100 pounds per acre?
Well, basically, if you believe Brady and Weil, they say, I think that for every percent of soil organic matter, you can get 20 to 40 pounds oxidized per year, released per year, okay? So if you've got 4% soil organic matter, you've got somewhere between 80 and 160 pounds.
Well, that's not even as much as you took off of the crop.
No, you only took off 75 to 100, right? And you have additional coming from precipitation and decomposition, right? So you can plan on another 15 to 30 annual contribution from precipitation and decomposition of plant residues. That's
Well,
just
the crop residues, if you don't till them under, you're going to lose most of the nitrogen anyway.
no, not true at all. Plant residues do not volatilize, right? The decomposition will take place whether it's covered with soil or not. That is not going to volatilize. So, I mean, the real question is the soil organic matter levels, did they remain stable? There is no indication that Iroquois were practicing shifting cultivation. No indication at all. They were in the same fields continuously, right? There were lots of indications that they were burning, right? And they did sometimes change fields, but they were not rotating fields, cutting, burning, resting, and returning to the same field. And I mean, you could argue that they had plenty of soil, they had no need to return to the same field. So there could be an argument that, yes, they were cutting and burning and they were going to new fields, but the indication is no. There's very little evidence in the historical documents that they were routinely opening new fields, particularly because of soil depletion. No indication of that at all. Lots of indication of that in New England, along the eastern seaboard, Virginia, North, South Carolina, Georgia. Lots of indication that that's what farmers there were doing, because they were really having problems because they had these Alfisols or Spodosols or Inceptisols that had much lower amounts of soil organic matter.
We've got some questions up in Geneva.
Sorry, forgot you were there. Yes, fire away.
Jane, I was wondering, in the last couple of decades, we've seen quite a bit of attention to reduce tillage in this very same region. And I was wondering if you have any observations on how that is being done, and if it's being done in a way that increases the odds of recovering the productivity.
I mean, I think that any attempts to decrease tillage are going to be helpful for long-term, productivity of soils. But I think it also means that you have to look at how do you get that organic matter back in. Not just that you stop tilling, but that you begin to use other practices, whether they're cover crops or animal manure, things that will increase soil organic matter. I know when I've spoken with Quirine Kettering about corn yields, she says that she can predict a corn yield based on the soil organic matter content, almost, depending on where it comes from, right? But that any time that they have soil organic matter levels that are between 3 and 4%, it's very hard for them to get a higher yield, regardless of how much inorganic fertilizers they add. So certainly soil organic matter, I think, is being increasingly recognized as the key to productivity. And in general, it's hard to increase soil organic matter just by adding nitrogen. You have to have other practices in place that allow for that to happen.
Jane, do we have any information on rainfall or rainfall patterns over that period of time that could have been, besides the organic soil, organic matter, that there could be some other offsetting that made plant growth more luxurious during that era?
No, and there's even some indications that there were several periods in which temperatures were quite a bit cooler, which would actually cause quite a bit of difficulty with corn growth. And some indications that in some years things did not go well. So that yields, declined because of, climate, weather, and about precipitation, I don't have any information at all. But most of the time in New York, we don't suffer terribly from precipitation, deficit. We do get the occasional drought years, but I would suspect that they would be relatively similar with the ups and downs that we still see. Chris?
What would happen if you superimpose, instead of continuous corn, the Three Sisters program on these soils? Would it decrease the pressure on soil organic matter and nitrogen, or would it
a lot of the results I showed you actually were, some were from corn monoculture, and some of those corn yields were from Three Sisters, were from polycultures. What we found was that there was no difference in corn yields, whether they were grown as monocultures or as Three Sisters. So my observation is that in terms of nitrogen, the beans would provide almost nothing because they're being eaten. There is some in the stems and leaves. Over a long term, you're kind of adding to the pool that soil nitrogen pool is getting added to. But in the short term, not much. The quantity, it's hard to make any estimates. What we found was that although corn yields were not affected by whether they were grown as monocultures or polycultures, that beans and pumpkin were greatly affected. In other words, you took a tremendous drop in yields if you compared bean monoculture to being grown as part of the Three Sisters. There's also evidence that the Iroquois grew beans by themselves and grew pumpkins by themselves. They didn't always grow them mixed in. So they were clearly, kind of deciding whether they needed to add to their stores of beans. They probably didn't plant them with corn. If they were looking maybe to trade or something like that, they probably put in monocultures of those. And how much that might have impacted, there's not a lot of crop residue from beans, and not a whole lot from pumpkin either, or squash. You can get fairly substantial amounts of crop residue from corn, particularly good crop. So I would think that the major effect comes from corn and not from beans or pumpkin. Yes?
I I've seen pictures, especially from elementary school days, of black and white line drawings of presumably coastal Native Americans showing settlers how to fertilize their corn by
With
planting
fish.
a fish.
Yeah.
Now, is that revisionist history, completely bogus, or what's that all
It
about?
seems to be some combination. There's been a huge argument going on for about 50 years about how true that is. My sense is that it may have been true for coastal Indians. They were growing on spodosols and on really poor nutrient status soils, and it would have made sense for them to do that. They were also growing much smaller areas. There's no indication of 100, 200 acre fields of corn out in New England, right, at the time of contact. Whereas Iroquois are growing on some of the finest soils we have in the country. I mean, they're not mollisols, but they're pretty darn good. And they're growing these huge acreages. So, I mean, how in the world do you gather up all these fish and throw them to each mouth? It doesn't seem realistic. So, and it doesn't match with kind of what we know about those soils. It's a lot of work to do for no response, right? You throw the fish in and nothing happens, you still get the same great yield, right? So. Yes?
I'm just wondering how good of an estimate of the total area in cultivation at this time was, and how good estimates do we have of the total population to get some idea of the balance?
Excellent questions. Likely to be quite small, because the total population was probably quite small. Populations were going up and down because of disease, because of warfare. So the Iroquois populations were probably never much higher than 40 to 50,000 people. And so when we looked at what the areas that, if you look at village sites and look at the areas of good land, around those village sites, if you go out to Genesee, in that area, if you look up at Denonville, and you look at the highest yielding soils, it's way more than what they could possibly have utilized, right? So they did not have the types of land pressure that were, evident in other areas, right? So they were not using nearly the land that they had to the capacity that it could have been done. So certainly a small population on good soils and not being pushed to use the resource to its full extent. Yes.
Sort of related to that, how large was the community that might be associated with 100 acres of corn?
Anywhere from a couple hundred to a couple thousand. And we don't know if that 200 acres of corn was the only field that was had by a particular community, or if they had a couple. But generally, Iroquois villages tended to be a couple of hundred up to as many as 2,000. So up in Geneva, there's a Seneca community at about 1720 that may have been around 1,500 people. So not huge, areas, but then again, not insignificant or not huge populations. There's a whole lot more work that could be done matching kind of soils and populations. We're beginning to get some good estimates on actual population numbers. There's a number of Iroquois studies scholars who are working very diligently on that. Actually, 2 of them right here at Cornell. So very interested in population numbers and how they're going up and down. I just have to persuade them that it's worthwhile to look at the soils and the agricultural potential too. So they're mildly interested. Okay, well, thank you. Do we have any more questions?
This has been a production of Cornell University. On the web at cornell.edu.